Before we get on to business, can I just remind members, you remember that thing called social distancing? Well, apparently we're not being too good at it at some point today. So I just remind you not to slip into bad habits. I'm not looking at anybody in particular, actually. I've just happened to land my eyes on you. It's got nothing to do with you, actually. You look guilty, though. Now, the next item of business is a statement by John Swinney on ensuring a safe and welcoming return to school for children, young people and staff. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, so there should be no interventions or interruption. I call on John Swinney. Cabinet Secretary, please.
President Officer, the day our children start school for the first time is a moment every parent remembers. However, I am aware that in some parts of the country, although plans were in place to open schools today, roads have been closed due to severe flooding following last night's storms. A number of schools in Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire, East Ayrshire, Falkirk, Fife, Highland and Perth and Kinross have sustained damage or difficulty of access, and others have been unable to open as planned. For those schools, it was definitely not the start of term they were planning for, and the weather issues will be the subject of a resilience call this afternoon. Elsewhere across the country, parents proudly dress their children, many in school uniform for the first time, take photographs and lead them off to school. I know it is a day that I will certainly never forget. For older children, the start of the school year is equally a milestone. For many, it may be the first time for months that they have seen, met and spoken to their peers, and I'm sure there will be much joy and laughter. The excitement of a new teacher, a new classroom, perhaps new classmates, and each year marks a step in their growth towards maturity and adulthood. Every year is special. This year, even more so. Lockdown's grip was signalled the most powerfully by the closure of our schools. Nothing else captured quite the seriousness of the pandemic than the fact that we were forced to send children home from school. Schools that had stayed open through world wars and national crises closed their gates. Such was the power of the pandemic. That is why this week marks a milestone, not just in our children's lives, but in our nation's recovery from COVID, a step towards growth and renewal. This week, we reopen our schools. Presiding Officer, I know that some people are anxious. That is not surprising. This was a momentous step evoking mixed emotions. On top of all the worry parents feel every year, everyone knows the virus is still out there. So people rightly ask, how will we keep our schools safe? And how will we support our teachers, pupils and young people through the weeks and the months ahead? Given all our nation has gone through, the pain and sacrifice people have endured, it is a question we must face and we must answer. The Scottish Government made a choice some time ago. Schools are of such critical importance to the life and well-being of our children, of our nation, that we could not keep them closed for a moment longer than necessary. We knew that every day they remained closed, it kept staff and pupils safe from the virus, but it also imposed other harms on them, on our society and on our collective future. That could not be ignored. So the Government decided that schools must be a priority. We decided that as we eased lockdown, we would forgo opening other parts of society. We would give up the chance to do so many of the things we all enjoy and used to take for granted in order that we could get children back to school. It meant that we had to say not yet to the impassioned pleas of other sectors. It meant that we had to look them in the eye and tell them that they had to stay closed. They could not return because there was a higher priority, the return to schooling of our children. And this week, at last, that choice bears fruit and our schools can reopen. I want to take a moment to recognise that even while our school buildings have been closed, our school communities have not been closed. Across the country, thousands of teachers worked tirelessly to reach out through online learning to their pupils. It was difficult, it was stressful, and it was a shift that proved hard for many. But the dedication and commitment of so many was plain to see, and I should not pass by the opportunity to record my thanks to them for their efforts in these most trying of times. As we have planned for the return of school, we've seen that there are real concerns that we have to address. Last week's EIS survey saw responses from almost 30,000 teachers, the largest return that the EIS have had to a survey. The returns confirmed 60% of teachers support the decision to reopen schools, but a similar figure expressed anxiety and a lack of confidence that sufficient mitigations would be in place to make them feel safe. This morning I visited Monifieth High School in Angus and met with pupils and staff at the start of the school day. The preparations that have been made were impressive, and the commitment of staff to make them work was beyond question. There was, however, an underlying anxiety and uncertainty about what lay ahead, because the arrangements in the school are going to be different. I understand that anxiety and uncertainty, and I give the assurance that I will constantly work to address those concerns. I would say to all pupils, teachers and staff that we have been and will continue to listen to the views of all of these groups and be guided by the very latest scientific advice. Today, I have published a note from the Chief Medical Officer summarising the very latest science in respect of COVID-19 and schools. The key points in that note are as follows. The most important factor for reopening schools is the level of community prevalence of COVID-19. Here we have a very encouraging picture. Whilst Aberdeen reminds us that we need to stay on our guard, the national trend is remarkable. We estimated that on the 31st of July, there were around 25 new cases of COVID-19 in Scotland. That compares to around 780 on the 15th of May. The estimated number of people in the whole of Scotland who were infectious on this date was around 275. That is in stark contrast to the estimated 10,000 on the 15th of May. Such is the scale of the reduction. And, Presiding Officer, the evidence is equally positive for young people. There have been no COVID-19 related deaths in Scotland for people under the age of 15, and less than 1% of COVID deaths have involved people aged under 45 years. As at the 3rd of August, less than 1% of the cases of COVID-19 in Scotland had involved children aged under 15, and around 2% involved children and young people aged under 20. There have been no cases linked to any community school hubs which have been opened throughout the pandemic. There is a wide range of evidence on other aspects of COVID-19 and schools with strong consensus. For example, children infected with COVID-19 tend to become less ill. Linked to that, children are less likely than adults to transmit COVID-19, whether to each other or to adults. This explains in part why there have been community outbreaks internationally involving schools. Where there have been community outbreaks internationally involving schools, it appears most likely that the transmission has happened in the community and not in the school. Presiding Officer, that is not to say that we can at any stage drop our guard. The reopening of schools will involve mitigating measures such as enhanced hand hygiene, more frequent cleaning regimes and social distancing by and from adults. All of these are based on clear scientific evidence applying to children and young people as well as to adults. There are a variety of views about face coverings. Some studies suggest that given the low risk of transmission by children, the detrimental developmental impacts of extended face covering use may be greater than the potential protective benefit. There is irrefutable evidence about the value of schools themselves. Not going to school is of considerable harm in terms of educational advancement, wider development and mental well-being. Not being in school also means children and young people are less likely to be in contact with people who could identify harm with disproportionate impact on those from disadvantaged backgrounds. I assure Parliament that Ministers will be monitoring developments and progress very closely. COVID-19 is a new pandemic and we are following keenly the science as it emerges, and reopening schools is clearly a new development. That is why I am very pleased to announce that we are putting in place a programme of enhanced surveillance to be able to monitor progress and react quickly to developments on the ground. This will include from now, the start of term, full application in schools of Test and Protect, outbreak management and rapid testing for all those with symptoms. Schools will be able to register so staff with symptoms can be referred for priority access to testing as key workers, as well as being able to self-refer. There will be close ongoing monitoring of the virus in schools and among school-aged children and staff, again from the start of term. We are pulling data together from a range of sources so that we have a single clear data set to allow us all to track progress over time. For example, we will ensure that the Education Recovery Group is briefed regularly on parameters such as COVID rates in school-aged children and young people and in teachers, and also on the question of school absences. This data set will be enhanced over the autumn as we introduce a number of other measures. These will include a new record linkage study that will allow us to track and compare risks in different staff groups from next month, a new programme of serology testing to measure over time levels of antibodies in staff also from next month, and a programme of PCR testing of pupils and staff from a sample of schools designed to cast more light on transmission and prevalence for older pupils and staff in schools from October. Taken together, these surveillance measures will allow us to report regularly against key parameters and to make rapid adjustments in the light of evidence of developments on the ground, whether to tighten measures nationally or locally, or to reintroduce currently restricted activities such as assemblies or singing. But the surveillance programme is just one element of our plan. We recognise that the staff in our schools and nurseries are worried. They are worried about the children, but they are understandably worried about their own risks. Bluntly, this is a new and frightening virus. It is entirely reasonable for our staff to be concerned for their own health and to want to understand what we are doing to keep them safe. And more than that, I know they are often horrified at the idea that anything they do as an adult might risk the health of the young people in their care. So today I can announce that we are extending the testing programme. Teachers, nursery and school staff who are concerned that they may have been exposed to infection can now be tested for COVID-19 on demand, even if they show no symptoms. The step has been taken to provide additional reassurance to teachers and other staff as children and young people return to the classroom and to nursery. Presiding Officer, it is vital that these measures offer credible reassurance to all who have expressed anxiety about the reopening of schools. This work is set within the context of the moral and educational imperative of delivering education to every one of our children and young people. That drive must lie at the heart of all that we do, and I want to restate our vision and ambition for education in Scotland. Our collective aim is to achieve excellence and equity for all children. Our education recovery mission must be to further improve Scottish education and accelerate progress in closing the poverty-related attainment gap. But we must recognise that even as we rededicate ourselves to that task, our schools are not fully returning to normal. There will be changes, restrictions and constraints. The virus is still with us, so we will provide support. As previously announced, we are making a total additional investment of £135 million to ensure that our children, young people and staff can be welcomed safely back into schools. This includes £80 million to bring additional teachers and staff into Scotland's classrooms in the new school year to promote education recovery, renewal and a more resilient education system. This funding is sufficient for local authorities to recruit approximately 1,400 additional qualified teachers, with the final numbers determined by the precise mix of staff recruited and the needs of children and young people. We expect that these additional teachers will provide a range of additional support to help reframe the recovery work, including supporting schools to alter class sizes and composition where possible, as set out in the guidance. We are in no doubt that there have been negative impacts of a prolonged period out of school during lockdown, and now is the time to inject energy, pace and a renewed focus on all children achieving their potential. All staff have a vital role in this, and as the new term begins, additional staff can offer support to groups of learners who need more intense support and cover classes for teachers who are self-isolating. They will also be vital in responding to any further local outbreaks of the virus, which could necessitate implementation of contingency plans for blended learning for a period. In addition, we have been working with the General Teaching Council for Scotland to ensure that retired teachers and registered teachers who are not currently teaching can quickly get back into the profession wherever this proves necessary. The return to school does signal a milestone in the country's recovery from the pandemic, and that is important. It is also important that we continue to focus on the mental health and well-being of our children, our young people and our staff working in schools. I have previously indicated that as we return to school, well-being should be a central consideration. It is essential that remains the case. We know that education authorities and schools have support in place through whole school and targeted approaches to support children and young people as they return. This will include counselling support provided through schools, which will be available from this year across Scotland. In preparation for the return to school, Education Scotland has published new guidance on the resources available to support children and young people's learning about their well-being and to support their well-being. We are also working through the Education Recovery Group to develop new resources designed to support the well-being of school staff. All of these things will enable children and young people to reconnect to their schools, their friends and their learning, and to benefit once again from the care and support that schools provide. Presiding Officer, the virus imposed so many restrictions. It closed our schools and locked down our society, and it has taken so many lives. But we are determined. We have made a choice. Our children are our priority, and we will give them, their friends, their classmates, their daily routine back. In closing, I would like to remind Parliament that school has always been about more than learning. It is about joy, friendship, community and growth. The virus is still with us, but I make up this pledge to the pupils, parents and teachers of Scotland. We will keep our children safe, we will keep staff safe, we will keep our schools safe, and we'll get our children back to school.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Now, the Cabinet Secretary will take questions on the issues raised in the statement. I intend to allow around 40 minutes for questions. It sounds a lot, but there are 21 members wanting to ask questions, so the usual caveat. It would be helpful if members who wish to ask a question would press the request to speak buttons now. And I call Jamie Green to be followed by Ian Gray. Mr Green, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement? Also pay tribute to those who've worked relentlessly to keep schools open during the lockdown and also get them reopened, reacting very quickly to policy shifts with patience and a lot of enthusiasm. And that's all school staff, teachers, council workers, transport drivers, and also parents themselves who've become de facto teachers over the last few months. We wish them all the best this week. But having spoken to many parents and teachers this week, I know that some questions remain. So let me go straight into those, Cabinet Secretary. The first is around school safety. We know from the survey that the majority of teachers still do not feel safe today. Social media is awash with teachers and parents who are concerned at the sheer volume of people in one place and the inability to properly socially distance. So what can be done to reassure those who do raise concerns that schools are and will be safe places? The second is around PPE. Anyone who wants protection must get it. We know the cost of making schools safe already far outweighs financial support that councils have been given. So if they ask for more resource, funding or equipment to make schools safe, can we reassure them that they will get what they need? And lastly, we do know that localised clusters will occur. So what reassurances can we give parents now that schools will be the last to close and the first to reopen, that we will deal with outbreaks proportionately through fast testing, tracing, and that schools will reopen quickly and safely? That must be the primary concern of the government, that not a single day will be unavoidably lost of our children's vital education.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, on the first of the three questions that Mr Green raises with me on school safety, this is a fundamental question, and the whole issue about physical distancing has been considered at length by the scientific advisory group that has advised the Education Recovery Group and by the Education Recovery Group itself. The guidance is very clear about the position on on physical distancing and where it is appropriate for that to be maintained. What schools have been doing have been trying to minimise, in response to that guidance, the opportunities for there to be gatherings of individuals in congested spaces. And I saw at first hand the steps that have been taken in Monifeith High School, and I have seen in other settings the measures that have been put in place. And I think this is an ongoing challenge to ensure that staff confidence is built, that the guidance is implemented, it is followed, and that it is deployed in a proportionate fashion in all school settings. On the second point about PPE, any PPE that is required for the delivery of educational or support services within a school should be provided. There should be no question about that. In relation to the question of funding, the Government has already made available to local authorities £20 million to meet these costs, But we have also indicated that there is a further £30 million available should that be required to meet any costs in relation to the expansion, to the reopening of schools. And finally, on the question of localised clusters, I'm glad that Mr Green acknowledges that there may be the possibility of this happening in the future. And I went through in considerable detail in my statement the measures that we have put in place to monitor and to assess the prevalence of coronavirus as part of our wider efforts to suppress community transmission. There will be extensive monitoring, which will be supplemented to look at the position emerging among schools and young people. And obviously, if there is a necessity for us to take proportionate action in relation to the closure of an educational facility, that action will be taken, and the government and local authority partners will be determined to reopen facilities only when it is safe to do so and when appropriate measures have been undertaken. And that will be done as quickly as possible.
Thank you. Before I call Ian Gray, there's two members who appear to want to ask questions, but I haven't pressed the request to speak button, so if you don't, I'll not call you. Ian Gray, followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This is a welcome day as schools return, and I want to pay tribute to teachers, to school staff, to council officials who've worked so hard to make it happen. It was made even more challenging, of course, with weeks of planning for blended learning and social distancing overturned at the last minute, but they did it, and we can celebrate schools reopening today. Above all, let me wish pupils the best of luck. They have had a hard time, and returning will be tough in many ways too. A special word for those who are starting school for the first time ever today, and indulge me, Presiding Officer, if I mention Leo and Soren, my own grandsons, in day one of P1 today. Yes, pictures are available. Mr Swinney referred to the EIS survey showing most teachers support the return, and that's true, but it did, and he acknowledged this, also show that only 1 in 5 are comfortable with the mitigations in place. More testing will certainly help, but can I ask what other further mitigations will be explored? And since smaller class sizes are clearly one of those which could help, how many of those extra teachers does Mr Swinney believe are actually in place?
Cabinet Secretary.
First of all, can I wish Mr Gray's grandchildren well as they start school, and I'm sure it's been a very exciting day. I hope they got some sleep last night, which is more than could be said for the Swinney household, with the presence of thunder and lightning in Perthshire for most of the evening, or the night time, I should say. In relation to, Mr Gray raises a very substantive issue about the attitudes of teachers, and I have openly acknowledged that there is anxiety and nervousness on this question. And what I can say is that I've set out, and we've had extensive dialogue with the teaching professional associations and with other staff trade unions to formulate the guidance, and I appreciate their constructive contribution to that process. Equally, we have listened carefully to some of the issues, and what I've said today about testing, I hope, strengthens some of the confidence that members of staff feel. But there must be, and what I would add further to that, is a commitment to engage in further dialogue with the professional associations as the days go on and as we begin to see the issues that emerge from the process of opening schools. And indeed, there is a meeting of the Education Recovery Group on Friday to assess how the first few days have taken their course, and the Education Recovery Group will meet regularly to continue that review and reflection. And I remain open to any further changes in the guidance that would be of assistance. I've heard public commentary from the EIS General Secretary about face coverings, and my mind is by no means closed on that question in relation to the guidance that we have put out already. In relation to the recruitment of teachers, that is an issue for local authorities. The Government has made the resources available to local authorities. We do not yet have an update on the recruitment that has been undertaken, but as soon as that is available, I will share that with Parliament as appropriate.
I'll be hoping now that we can move on a little more swiftly with questions and answers. Ross Greer, followed by Beatrice Wishart, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement. I have two brief questions. The first is, the enhanced surveillance testing programme is very welcome, but quite simple question, why was it not ready now? Why will it take until October before it becomes fully operational? And further to that, the further testing for any teacher who wants it is very welcome, but will it be for them to request, or will it be regularly proactively offered, particularly for teachers in areas such as Aberdeen experiencing a local outbreak?
Cabinet Secretary.
On the first question, the enhanced surveillance programme does take time for us to build up. I think that's been it's been the clear experience throughout the pandemic that we have been building capacity. But what I would assure Mr Greer about is that in advance of that happening, there are a range of other surveillance measures and mechanisms in place that we can use existing testing capacity for and other data sets to create a strong picture of any issues that require to be resolved. In relation to his second point, the testing will be available where teachers request it. It will not, and it's an important point that teachers have got to want to go forward for that. And I've set out a position whereby any teacher can use that route to secure a test if they have concerns, and the test will be delivered as appropriately.
Beatrice Wishart, followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I was just following on from what Ian Gray asked about extra staff. How long will it be before all the extra staff will actually be on the ground, and what job security will they have, because people need security? And does it mean that every newly qualified teacher will have a job?
Cabinet Secretary.
So these are detailed recruitment issues for local government. The government does not employ the teachers. We allocate the resources. We've reached an agreement with local authorities about the recruitment of staff, and I am very confident that local authorities will be utilising those resources to ensure that they have that they're used to the full. In relation to the timescale for that, obviously local authorities will wish to press ahead with that recruitment at the earliest opportunity to ensure they've got maximum opportunity to benefit from the contribution these staff can make to their efforts.
I've been a bit easy on multiple questions, but unfortunately that does mean quite right that the Cabinet Secretary has to take longer to answer. That eats into time, so keep your questions to one question, please. Claire Adamson, followed by Jamie Halcroft-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary about the issue of wellbeing that he mentioned in his speech? Obviously, these are unprecedented times, and there was already a recognition that counselling was needed in schools. So I wonder, how is that progressing to actually ensure that the counsellors are available in our schools, and also what part can the wider community and third sector organisations play in supporting the wellbeing of our schools?
It's kind of like a couple of questions in there, but we'll perhaps get to one question at some point. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there are a range of schools that have existing relationships with organisations that support the well-being of their staff, and indeed again at Monifeith High School this morning I saw some of the specific recruitment decisions that the school have made there to invest in support in assisting in improving and strengthening the well-being and the mental well-being of young people within the school. The wider programme of the rollout of mental health counsellors will be completed by October, and that will fulfil the government's commitment to have that capacity in place around the country.
Jamie Halcroft-Johnson, followed by David Torrance.
I'm sure we all hope that blended learning, even if restricted to localised clusters, won't be necessary. But in the event that they do, it's important that the digital poverty issues that I've raised repeatedly have been addressed. On the 23rd of July, the Cabinet Secretary told me that laptops would be with students by the start of term, the 27th to 27th of July from the start of term. So can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that the Scottish Government has distributed all the 25,000 promised laptops to the pupils who need them or to their schools?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think I've made clear to, or I've tried to make clear to Mr Halcroft-Johnson that the government cannot distribute them to individual pupils. That is for local authorities and schools to undertake. 20,000 Chromebooks will have been shipped from the suppliers to local authorities by this Friday, and the remaining 5,000 will be shipped to local authorities by the end of next week, the 21st of August, and it will be for local authorities to distribute them to pupils at that time.
David Torrance, followed by Jackie Bailey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that despite the specifics of the advice to schools, the overall guiding principles for pupils, teachers and parents Are those set out in acronym facts?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, Presiding Officer, it's important that that guidance is put in place and that it's followed assiduously at local level to ensure that we have a safe reopening of schools within Scotland. We have to make sure that staff, pupils and parents are assured of the safety of the school environment, and that's been at the heart of the work to formulate the guidance and to make sure it can be put in place.
Jackie Bailey, followed by Richard Lyle.
And I welcome the additional mitigation measures for teachers and other school staff. I've been contacted by a parent who is concerned about face coverings. She has 2 children aged 14 and 17. They're required to wear face coverings on public transport, shops, churches, museums, libraries, but not in school when they are in contact with many people on a daily basis. Would the Cabinet Secretary review the guidance, particularly for older children, and consider a requirement to wear face masks?
Cabinet Secretary.
This has been an issue on which we've had specialist advice from the expert group, and the position that is taken in the guidance reflects that advice from the expert advisory group. Having said that, as I said to Ian Gray, my mind is far from closed on this question, and I do appreciate the very specific contrast that Jackie Bailey is raising in her question between the requirements that there will be out with school and the position within school. So I'm open to that question. I think some of the issues, and I highlighted in my statement, about the use of face coverings within school may well inhibit some of the ability of young people to properly and fully experience educational, to have a strong educational experience, but that has to be counterbalanced with the clinical advice that we receive. But my mind is far from closed on that question, and I think it will be one that the Education Recovery Group will return to in its subsequent discussions.
Richard Lyle, followed by Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Cabinet Secretary, I welcome your announcement today regarding testing if required or requested. Exactly 7 weeks ago, on the 24th of June, I asked you in this chamber to plan with councils to ensure our kids and teachers are safe going back to school this week. Do you believe that everything has been done to minimise any risk to ensure that it is safe to return to school? And would you agree with me that parents want their children back at school?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think generally parents do want children back at school because I think they realise and can see the significant benefits that will come to their children and young people from being at school. But there will be parents who have anxieties and worries about that process. It is therefore critical that the measures that are included within the guidance are properly applied in all school settings so that parents can be assured. And I think certainly looking at a range of material I've seen from around the educational community around Scotland, there has been significant investment of time and energy in advising parents about the arrangements that will be put in place, but that must be maintained by schools for a sustained period.
Daniel Johnson, followed by Fulton McGregor.
Last night I hosted a Zoom call with local parent councils, and while they welcomed the reopening of schools, their question was, if the circumstances arise that schools have to close again, on what basis will they be made? In particular, who will make that decision, what the criteria will be, and will there be a difference between school outbreaks and community outbreaks?
I thought we were getting single questions, but there we go again, Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, if a school has 2 positive cases within a 14-day period, it will be defined as having an outbreak. And in those circumstances, and indeed in a circumstance of any positive case within a school, the school should contact the local health protection team within the locality. And it then becomes a discussion which may vary depending on the circumstances and the composition of the outbreak as to what action is taken. But what I would assure Mr Johnson about, and I would welcome him passing this on to the parent councils with whom he had discussion, that there will be a very focused attention taken to any outbreaks that are in any way in proximity to a school. As I said in my statement, the most effective way in which we can protect schools is to minimise community transmission. And that, of course, is at the heart of the whole test and protect arrangement that we have in place. So there will be a very focused discussion about that. Schools will take advice from health protection teams at local level as to what appropriate action should be taken, and that must be taken in a timely fashion to protect the access to education for children and young people.
Fulton McGregor, followed by Alison Harris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I'm asking this question as a father of a kid who went into P2 today. And I'd like to thank his school and North Lanarkshire Council for all they've done to make him and us feel safe. That was very evident at the gates. And before I ask my question, I'd just like to take this opportunity as a parent and not an MSP to thank the Cabinet Secretary. Both he and the First Minister have given everything to put our young people first and worked tirelessly over this summer period in the midst of a global pandemic, and allowed to see the scenes that I've seen today at my son's school, for example.
Mr McGregor,
So
I understand,
well,
but please ask a question.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, but I did want to put that thanks on the record, given the week it's been. My question is on face coverings in school transport. It's pretty similar to where Jackie Bailey was going. I've had a number of queries from parents of school children concerned that they are not needed on school transport, and school transport particularly. And I'm wondering if the Cabinet Secretary can talk a wee bit about the thinking behind this, that may provide reassurance to my constituents who are
Thank you. There's a sort of a question about school transport built in there somewhere.
Presiding Officer, the advice that we received from the Clinical Advisory Group essentially advised us to extend the definition of the school estate from the physical buildings of the school to include school transport, dedicated school transport. And I make that distinction where the position on face coverings, where the balance of evidence that the Clinical Advisory Group looked at indicated that it was inadvisable to apply mandatory wearing of face coverings within schools. That then extends to the dedicated school transport. Now, of course, where Mr McGregor's question highlights some of the debate in this question is that on general public transport where school pupils are travelling, they would be required to wear face coverings in accordance with the regulations that are required more generally in society. And that's to acknowledge that general public transport is not part of the school estate. But as I said to Jackie Bailey, and I reiterate to Mr McGregor, this is an issue on which the Government will continue to listen carefully to representations that are made and to taking further scientific and clinical advice.
At this rate, I can say that I don't really get everybody in, which I'll be very disappointed if that happens. Alison Harris, followed by Alec Cole-Hamilton.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary will be aware of increased concerns over older secondary pupils that have emerged in recent weeks. While existing guidance does recognise some of the differences by age cohort, can the Cabinet Secretary address whether monitoring will extend to this particular issue and if any further guidance has been given?
Cabinet Secretary.
The monitoring most definitely will extend to that issue, and I hope what I said in my statement gives reassurance to members of Parliament that data will be gathered and will be reviewed regularly by the Education Recovery Group that addresses exactly that question. And if out of the analysis of that data there is a requirement to review any of the guidance, I give Parliament the assurance that that will be undertaken.
Alec Cole-Hamilton, followed by Kenneth Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Parents of the P1 intake in Edinburgh were written to by the City Council on Wednesday, advising them that the traditional soft start for P1s would be abandoned, that children would have to attend for a full day on their first day, and that parents who were dropping them off would be limited to one adult per child in the playground. Does he recognise that these children have suffered a great deal under lockdown? They haven't been in a formal peer group setting for 5 months, and that the soft start transition would be more important now than it has ever been before?
Cabinet Secretary.
I do acknowledge that, but it is important that while we have put in place a framework of guidance for the return of formal schooling, it is up to individual local authorities to determine their own position in their local environments, and it's an issue quite clearly for the City of Edinburgh Council, and I'm sure the City Council can explain to Mr Cole-Hamilton why it arrived at that decision.
Kenneth Gibson, followed by Brian Whittle.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For schools to open successfully, it's crucial to have the confidence of pupils, parents and staff that it's safe to do so. Does the Cabinet Secretary therefore agree with Professor Russell Viner, President of the Royal College of Paediatrics, that, and I quote, there is very little evidence that COVID-19 is transmitted in schools, following a study of 20,000 pupils and teachers in 100 schools by Public Health England, and that this evidence should help to reassure all concerned?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think as Mr Gibson highlights one particular piece of evidence, and there's a lot of evidence beginning to emerge around about this question. We've looked at a whole range of international examples to guide the thinking that has gone into how we could reopen schools safely. So we have undertaken that task. We will continue to monitor that, the emerging international evidence, and I think the study that Mr Gibson cites does help in creating that reassurance. And I also advise Parliament that these studies are reflected on by the Chief Medical Officer and by the advisory group and form the continuing flow of advice that comes to the Education Recovery Group on who take the decisions about guidance.
Brian Whittle, followed by Polly McNeill.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And can I declare an interest in my eldest starts her job today as Head of Department at a secondary school, and I had the pleasure of walking my youngest in to start S1 secondary school this morning. How on earth did that happen? Cabinet Secretary, in your statement you mentioned the other harms imposing lockdown has had on pupils, and of course we recognise there's a balancing act to be done here. However, we also know the impact of other medical conditions on the response to COVID, like obesity and diabetes. So, Cabinet Secretary, do you agree with me that it's imperative to reintroduce PE into the curriculum? However, we may need to adapt those classes for the benefit of both the pupils' physical and mental health. And how is the Scottish Government assessing this issue?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it's. I agree with the point that Mr Whittle makes and his understanding of the balance of harms with which we are wrestling here. And I think the key point that I would highlight in Mr Whittle's question is his understanding that there may need to be an adaptation in how physical education is delivered, rather than just taking the view that what was done before must be reapplied. There will be a need to undertake some redesign and redeployment. I'm certain that physical education staff will be committed to doing exactly that, because they will want to make sure that young people have that experience within schools. And I'm sure that on that basis, we can make the progress that I know Mr Whittle's policy interests will reflect in making sure that young people have an experience of physical education to support their mental and physical well-being.
Polly McNeill, followed by Mark MacDonald.
According to the EIS, 40% of teachers still feel unsafe in attending at work this week. But what specific support, therefore, can the Cabinet Secretary offer teachers who just need some general mental health support for the day-to-day worries that you've already talked about? Have you thought how every school or a cluster of schools could be offered that type of mental health support?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think it is a very important point, and I think within the approaches that individual schools are taking, and certainly the discussions that I've had with a number of schools about the preparations that they are making, the reassurance and well-being of staff has been absolutely critical to what they are trying to do. So I don't think in any way, I think probably the best reassurance I can give Polly McNeill at this stage is that I think that is recognised fundamentally within the education system. And it has to be addressed through reassurance and support, and that may become more intense for particular members of staff. One piece of encouragement I would say in this respect is that when as I said earlier, we've looked closely at international evidence, and international experience tends to suggest that as the weeks go by, confidence grows in the way in which schools are taken forward. But what is critical in the foundations of that is that mitigation measures are being followed at all times, and that builds confidence in members of staff as a consequence. But I think the suggestion about a clustering arrangement is a very valuable suggestion.
Mark MacDonald, followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As with other members, my son started S1 today. My daughter will start P6 later this week. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for helping me rule out teaching as a future career option over the recent months? And can I also ask him, parents in Aberdeen are obviously concerned about their children going back to school while local restrictions remain in place. I hear the reassurances in general which have been provided, but what specific reassurances can the Cabinet Secretary provide today which I can relay to my constituents, some of whom are concerned about their children returning to school while Aberdeen remains under local measures?
Cabinet Secretary.
President Officer, I recognise the acute significance of the point that Mr MacDonald makes about schools in the city of Aberdeen. My officials are in very active discussion with Aberdeen City Council in relation to all of these questions, and I know the City Council is focused on ensuring that all necessary measures have been taken in all schools to be confident about the arrangements. Obviously, what I've set out today in terms of the surveillance measures will be available in the City of Aberdeen, and of course there is a very clear leadership in the City of Aberdeen just now in relation to the incident management team around the outbreak that we currently have there, which is looking in ever more forensic detail at all of the cases and the contacts that are being pursued. So the test and protect arrangements that are in place in Aberdeen today are focusing very closely on the possibility of transmission and doing everything in its power to stop that, and that will extend into schools into the bargain.
Maureen Watt, followed by Jeremy Balfour. You're on mute.
The importance of putting children, both their safety and their ability to learn, at the heart of the return to schools. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm that the work done to provide for the reopening of schools has been undertaken with the principle of getting it right for every child to the forefront?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, Presiding Officer, that is the case, and one of the key elements of the guidance is to acknowledge that for some young people the access to education will have to be undertaken in a different fashion to meet the individual needs of that individual child. So at the heart of the guidance, that point is accepted, and I know that individual schools have looked very carefully at how they can make sure, particularly after the prolonged lockdown that we have had, that young people are supported to make their return to education as appropriate for those individuals as it possibly can be.
Jeremy Balfour, followed by Gordon MacDonald.
We've heard discussions already from the Deputy First Minister about the wearing of face masks. I've been contacted by a number of parents here in Edinburgh whose children are in mainstream school but have additional support. They've been told that the additional teacher support have to wear a face mask if they're in contact with that child for more than 15 minutes. That's causing a lot of distress, and children are refusing maybe to go to school because of that fear. If face masks don't have to be worn normally by pupils, why should they be worn when we're dealing with children with additional needs?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the issue that I think the key point in answering Mr Balfour's question is the issue about physical distancing. And in a classroom setting where physical distancing can be delivered, the guidance says there is no requirement for face coverings, but that is where 2 metres physical distancing can be supported. Obviously, in the circumstances that Mr Balfour raises, there may be closer proximity required to support the young person. That's where the guidance essentially reflects the position of requiring to wear face coverings. So it's an acknowledgement of the ability to protect members of staff. Now, I appreciate, and Mr Balfour's question highlights this, that may be off-putting to a child or young person. And that is one of the reasons why the guidance that we have and the advice that we have indicates that in all circumstances it would not be advisable to have mandatory face coverings in schools. So Mr Balfour's question highlights the dilemma, and I think provides an explanation as to why it's put in place, or that requirement is put in place for children with additional support needs in certain circumstances.
Gordon MacDonald, followed by Sarah Boyack.
What reassurance can the Cabinet Secretary provide for teachers and school staff who are anxious about socialising with family and friends who fall into the vulnerable categories after interacting with not only hundreds of young people in their school, but also with their teaching colleagues?
Cabinet Secretary.
The first thing I would say is that in relation to interaction with teaching colleagues, members of staff should be observing physical distancing at all times. And that's one of the implicit parts in the guidance. Secondly, I think what I would say to Mr MacDonald is that to the general guidance that we have issued as a government to those who have, for example, been shielding, is that while shielding has been paused, people in that category need to take additional care about their interaction and their contact. So I would encourage Mr MacDonald to advise constituents about the need to follow that general guidance to address the point of concern that he's raised with me today.
And Sarah Warwick.
First Minister, you referred to the nervousness expressed by so many teachers. Are there up-to-date statistics on the numbers of teachers who've decided to retire early this year? I've spoken to several teachers who've told me that's what they're doing because they're worried about safety requirements and are concerned about the vagueness of the guidance on issues like social distancing. Is that a concern you have?
Cabinet Secretary.
I don't have data on that point, although it will become clear as we go through the school year. And there will obviously be the survey of teaching staff, which is undertaken in September, the results of which we will see in December. But obviously local authorities and the General Teaching Council will be able to give us some further data on retirement decisions. I think obviously there is a level of anxiety. I have accepted that, but what I would reassure Sarah Boyack about is the importance the government attaches, and our partners within the Education Recovery Group, our local authority partners and other stakeholders are focused on trying to build that confidence over time and to ensure that teachers feel safe and confident to come to practice in our schools.
Thank you. That concludes questions on the statement. We did manage to get everybody in. There will be a short pause before we move on to the next item of business. It's a follow-on, so all members who are in the next debate should really be either just outside the chamber or in the chamber.